It was a story of betrayal, allegations from anonymous sources that British intelligence agents had to be pulled out of hostile countries for their own safety because they had been exposed by Edward Snowden. The headline in the Sunday Times was bold and unequivocal. The reporter, when interviewed on the story, asked about how he knew what he reported was not.
Well, I mean, I thought this interview was laughable. I mean, it's one of the worst interviews I've ever seen any journalist give on TV ever.
It's very difficult to say anything with certainty. We don't go into that level of detail in the story.
Almost every single question that he was asked in regard to can you substantiate this, can you substantiate that, his answer was...
well, I don't know. We don't know. Sorry to just repeat myself, George, but we don't know.
Well, maybe he should get an award for bravery by going out there, because all he could say was...
We just publish what we believe to be the position of the British government at the moment.
What else could he say? He could have said, we have very good sources, we've checked it out amongst a lot of people, put it into context, why they're writing this story now, but he couldn't, he didn't.
That interview was extraordinary because it really just illustrated how hollow and terrible the story in itself was, because there was nothing behind it, there was nothing to back it up.
It is the standard practice of the British government never to confirm or deny any allegation that is made about intelligence in respect of our national security. So you say short on detail, what kind of detail would you expect? So please don't come to me with stories of Edward Snowden being a good guy and the Sunday Times and the British establishment being bad guys.
A spokesperson for the Sunday Times said, "We reported what various reliable and well-informed sources from within the government told us. This story was responsible journalism and another example of the Sunday Times setting the news agenda." Whether the paper was setting the agenda or just had one of its own, other news outlets followed. And not just those owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, such as Sky News and the Wall Street Journal, which instantly accused Snowden of assisting dictators while harming defenders of democracy. The publicly owned BBC led with the story, despite the protests of one of its own guests.
And if I may say so, Gavin, I think it's extraordinary that the BBC this morning is leading on a story where there's simply no evidence that it's actually true at all.
Reuters, a major news agency, ran with the Sunday Times story without taking issue with the sourcing or the journalism. The New York Times then published the Reuters story on its site. The Washington Post eventually published a blog questioning the Sunday Times' methods, but only did so after publishing that same Reuters article. The story rifled through the media food chain, Al Jazeera English included.
Edward Snowden's supporters have always maintained he acted in the public interest, but these latest accusations will strengthen the argument among his critics that in fact he's always posed a threat to the national interests of countries such as the US and Britain.
Usually the media is generally quite terrible at doing a proper job of dissecting these hatchet job kind of stories. The online news sites and the ones that do the kind of aggregated reporting churned it out immediately as if this was verbatim truth, you know, handed down by some god, you know, this could not be questioned possibly. But after a few hours, the next day, there was quite a lot of good sort of sceptical reporting on it.
There certainly has been rhetoric around Snowden's actions that have been hyperbolic. This quote from the Sunday Times article that said Snowden had blood in his hands was a bit overdone. There's no evidence of that. I think that's a pretty scurrilous charge to make without any real evidence behind it. Whether he's a traitor, whether he's committed treason, those are fair questions to raise. There's a little bit of hyperbolic rhetoric around this. Nonetheless, I don't think that's what's dominating the narrative, dominating the debate about Snowden.
Your suggestion seems to be the story was rubbish, it was then picked up by the Murdoch press, it was then picked up by the BBC, therefore everybody's picking up rubbish. I turn it round to you and I say the story was a good story, it was a solid story, and it was entirely convincing and plausible. That's why the rest of the media picked it up.
There is the current political context to consider. Not only has the US Congress recently voted away some of the NSA's surveillance powers, but the Cameron government's own official reviewer of anti-terrorism legislation called for British surveillance laws to be reformed with judicial oversight that has been lacking. That report came out June 11th. The Sunday Times story went to print just 3 days later. And there is an historical pattern regarding notable whistleblowers, the governments they expose, and the news media. In 1973, when Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers on the war in Vietnam, the Nixon White House testified the papers had been given to the Soviet embassy in Washington. That was proven false, but only after the allegation had been published far and wide. In 2010, when Chelsea Manning leaked the Afghan war logs through WikiLeaks to the media, the Obama White House testified that Manning and WikiLeaks might already have blood on their hands by recklessly putting U.S. soldiers at risk. Eventually, administration officials admitted they had no evidence to back that up, but that admission got far less coverage in the media than the original accusation. And so it is again in 2015, with Edward Snowden and the evidence-free allegations in the Sunday Times article echoing across other news organizations, amounting, Snowden supporters say, to a smear campaign.
I thought this was rather strange, actually. A story which was essentially not new. It did not say anything new.
The suggestion is that our security services as a whole have been damaged.
We all knew that, MI5, MI6, GCHQ were concerned about Edward Snowden's leaks 2 years before. And it takes some kind of defensive action, damage limitation action, because that's their job. Why repeat it now?
I don't think Edward Snowden is being smeared. I think people's analysis of what he did is being interpreted as a smear. I'm not trying to smear Edward Snowden. I think what he did was incredibly dangerous, was foolish, put U.S. national security at risk. To be very candid, the smear campaign is not being launched against Snowden. It's being launched against those who want to question Snowden's actions. If you point out that his actions may not be heroic, and you're a journalist who does this, you end up getting attacked.
Many journalists and the news organizations they work for have taken sides over Edward Snowden. The American revealed much about surveillance states on both sides of the Atlantic. He has also exposed, as if anyone had to, the media in Great Britain, the newspapers whose coverage says as much about who they are as it does about Edward Snowden and the issues he has raised. On the download this week, our viewers on the Sunday Times and the continuing fallout from the Snowden story.
Last week's Sunday Times article on Edward Snowden really exemplifies the ways in which journalists, particularly those working for large and established news organizations with conservative agendas, can absolutely push the narrative that security agencies are trying to create, even when there is very limited evidence. The press helps politicians justify ever more repressive measures in terms of surveillance, and the whole cycle continues, pushed and enabled by compliant journalists.